Welcome to the Pastured Pig Podcast, where we share the successes and challenges of raising pigs on pasture. We talk to producers all over the country, from small homesteads to large commercial pasture operations. Whether you're new to pastured pigs or have been raising hogs for decades, we hope you hear new ideas and new perspectives on pasturing hogs. Here's your host, Troy McClung.
All right, it's round 3 of our 4-box set here with our podcast. So today we're going to have a little bit different approach and kind of more of a homesteading level. But I like what Jordy's got going on here with. There's the timer on my there's the timer on my ham that I'm smoking. Hey, looky there. So Jordy has something going on a little unique with Asian Heritage Hogs or pot-bellied pigs. And I'll let him obviously tell that story, but it's pretty interesting to see what he's got going on there. Also, there's a little bit of delay because of technology back and forth, so if you just notice some dead airspace between our questions and answers, it's just because of technology, not because there's a tension building between us. All right, let's get into the conversation. Today, we're going up to Michigan, and we're going to talk with Jordy Buck from Northern Homesteading. Welcome, Jordy.
Well, thank you.
All right. So I have to ask you, it seems like you probably get this question all the time when you tell people from Michigan, are you a Youper or are you not?
No, I'm not. I live in west central Michigan between Grand Rapids and Big Rapids. So I don't get up to the UP very often.
Okay. So you're in the mitt. So if they call Upper Peninsula Youpers, what do they call lower state?
Well, the Youpers call us trolls because we live below the bridge.
That's great.
So that's a thing. Yeah.
Yeah. That's pretty good. I like that. I've not heard that one yet. All right. So
yeah.
So tell me a little bit about your setup. Let's start with the 40,000 foot elevation view. What do you got going on up there?
Well, up in Michigan, I have 1 acre, just about exactly. So a pretty small property. My wife and our 5 kids are on the property. We raise quite a few pigs there. I grow produce for the local farmers market and for our own family quite a bit. And we got the chickens and the rabbits, kind of the whole homesteading thing. And I focus a lot more on the more self-sustaining, sustainable and regenerative type of homesteading techniques. And well, a couple of years ago, I started getting a little bit more into these pigs. So, golly, I've got 16 pigs right now in our pig pen, not including the boar, back in our paddock areas. And it's getting a bit filled out up here now.
Okay, so make sure I understand. So you're talking 1 acre. You have 16 pigs, boar, and you also do market gardening as well, plus your other homesteading, all on 1 acre. So there's a lot of questions I want to ask you.
I do.
It sounds a little tight in some places.
I actually have a little bit of wiggle room, believe it or not. Okay. Not much, but I have a little.
All right. Well, let's talk about this 1 acre first, because I know, when I think of 1 acre, I think of a West Virginia 1 acre, which is there's a portion of it that you can't even access because it's so steep. But describe your 1 acre as far as topography and ground cover and all that type of stuff.
Well, my 1 acre it's a slight incline, kind of moderately flat ground, but I mean it's inclined, but it's smooth inclined. Kind of starting from the road, it just kind of goes a little higher up from there as you go back. The property is about 360 feet deep and about 130-ish feet wide. So it's kind of a long, skinny place. And it was about 90% forested, fairly mature forest. But the past 4 years, we've cleared most of that out. I just finished clearing most of the back half acre out this spring, and that was a chore and a half, clearing all them trees out. A lot of big old cottonwoods and black oak back there. But we got most of that cleared out, and I'm turning the back there into a combination of kind of annual and perennial paddocks for we're planting annual and perennial crops back there for the pigs to be rotating through. In the front half acre, that's a majority of that has been the market garden. I'm probably downsizing a bit of that because I am putting in a greenhouse. I have one small little 21 foot by 7 foot wide cattle panel greenhouse that I've been using. And I am putting up structure right now that's about it's about a 20 by 40, I guess is what it is. And I'm converting that. It's an old pool cover is what it is. And I'm converting that thing like a canopy into a greenhouse to get started with a little bit of nursery work.
Wow. Man, you've got a lot going on there for sure. What's the
Well, it's kind of like I just don't have enough to do, even though I'm already working 60 hours a week and doing a little side work as a writer on top of that. So apparently I needed more.
Right. Well, that's what I was going to ask you is this a full-time gig? But it sounds like you do have a full-time or a day job at least, and maybe even a side hustle.
This is definitely part-time.
Yeah.
I'm managing it as well as I can to be very simple to coordinate and put together pretty tightly so that I can keep it part-time. And I try so hard not to waste time with all of the extras that I'm doing. And that's made it manageable enough for me with the time that we have.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, I'm going to assume, I have no idea your age, but I'm going to assume your kids are probably not at the age where they are super productive farm help yet.
My oldest just turned 6.
Okay, so they're probably more in the liability versus asset when it comes to actual farm work then, if that's fair to say.
Oh yeah, I've got to watch behind my shoulder every step of the way. One of my girls, golly, in particular, my second youngest, no matter what I'm doing, she's got to be helping me, and so I got to keep an eye out for her.
Yeah, exactly. You always got to be with Daddy and do what Daddy does. Yeah. Farming that
she
can be a little challenge. Yeah.
Dragging grabbed my double bit axe and was dragging it across the yard for me to use yesterday, and that thing's bigger than she is.
Yeah, no doubt. Yeah. Oh my goodness. So I want to ask you one more question about the land. So what's the soil like around there? Is that sandy Michigan soil, so it's well draining?
Well, it's actually it's fairly well draining, but it's not quite the pure sands that I grew up on. Where I grew up, it was actually halfway between like savanna land and sand dunes, a little further south. But my property it's just got a little bit of clay, but it's a nice mix of sand, silt, and clay. It's predominantly sand, but there's enough silt and clay in there that it's functional enough.
Yeah, good deal. Well, obviously the question I think everybody's thinking right now with 17 pigs on that size tract, what breed of pig are we talking about here? I know that's what people are thinking.
Well, I raise pot-bellied pigs. Sometimes I call them Asian Heritage Hogs. That's kind of a older term that floats around. And I kind of like using that term because pot-bellies aren't really a unique breed. They're more of a grouping of many different breeds kind of brought together and thrown under one subheading there. So, I mean, there are 16 unique Asian breeds of pigs that you could call very similar to a potbelly. Those dwarf Asian pigs that in history they're often just referred to as China pigs. And they're all smaller, they're all black, but there's a wide variation between all these different smaller Asian pigs. And what we know as the American potbelly, or sometimes called the American Vietnamese potbelly, is really kind of a mesh together of 4 different landrace breeds that came out of Vietnam between the 60s and the 80s after the war over there. And so what we have today, for the most part, if you're talking a pure line potbelly, it's some integration of 4 different fairly unique breeds of those Vietnamese hogs. And there's a lot of variation between them, but they're all solid black or mostly black, and they're all small. They're all lard pigs, and they all have a real thick, stout head, thick neck, and they're real muscular on the neck and shoulders, and they have a short snout. So that, and if they're purebreds, they never have a curly tail. That's the only really thing that all these different breeds usually have in common. And so the Potbelly, there's a ton of variation. They're all small, but there's still so much variation in their genotypes and in the types of raising environments they thrive in and the types of feeds that they do best on. And there's a lot of variation in there. And they haven't really been bred out to make one particular cookie cutter type pig very much at all. So they have a lot of variability and a lot of adaptability because of that.
Interesting. Yeah, I got to say, I don't know much about that breed of hog. It's just not something that's come up on my radar. When somebody says Potbelly, I automatically think of somebody's pet that they're walking on a leash and has a little diamond studded collar and all that type of stuff. That's what sticks in my head. So
yeah, it's funny. Potbellies, well, when they were first imported from Vietnam, and then they made their way eventually to Canada and then to the U.S., they were an exotic, so they were really sought out by zoos for the most part and petting zoos really throughout the 80s and 90s. And then they were kind of marketed as a pet pig for a while because they were small, advertised as a mini pig, even though they can still get 200 or 250 pounds when they're grown. But now the pet crowd has taken on the term American miniature pig. And they don't want to be associated with the Potbelly term because traditionally Potbelly is a Asian meat hog. So it's just kind of funny how they're doing that.
Yeah, so that's so you said something there. So you're saying your hogs, when they're a full size, mature size, they're still about 200 and 225 on the hoof?
When I'm talking mature breeders. So, and there's variation, a lot of variation in the line, but generally when I go and I look at a lot of other people's Potbelly herds, and when I see their breeders, they're generally somewhere between about 175 and 250 on the high side. I mean, my smaller sow right now, she's about maybe 18 months old, and she's probably 120 pounds. And she'll probably get another 75 pounds after that. Okay. So, yeah, she'll probably max out around 200, and that's not fat weight. I don't let my pigs get very fat. I know a lot of the pet Potbellies tend to get quite obese because they just kind of sit around and snack all day, but they are traditionally a pasture-type pig, honestly. When you see how they're raised traditionally in Vietnam, 99% is just forest fodder and fending for themselves, and they usually just get a little rice, a little grain now and then, and that keeps them tame and keeps them nearby.
Really interesting. So why did you land on this breed? I mean, obviously, I'm sure the property may have something to do with
reasons.
it. Yeah.
First off, I was looking at pigs, I was wanting to get some pigs. I had finally decided and kind of proved to myself that I'm pretty sure I could raise pigs cheap. That was one of the important things to me because for a long time, I mean, maybe 2 cents from, so I didn't have much money. I can't, raise expensive pigs if that's going to be costly to feed them out. So I proved to myself, kind of convinced myself I could do it cheap, and I just started looking around at what pigs were available. And the first one I actually got was a guinea hog. I stumbled upon somebody who had a couple guinea hogs, and they basically just had to get rid of them, didn't want them anymore, and we're getting back into goats. So I got those for quite cheap. And man, that boar they told me he was a big boned boar. When I showed up, I said, that ain't big boned, that's a fat boar. But he was probably 400 pounds for a 6-year-old guinea hog.
Oh my goodness.
And well, we raised him for a little bit, just tried to learn about pigs a little bit. I got him a little bit healthier, and then we ended up butchering him. But I decided I didn't really want to deal with pigs that were quite that size again. And just looking around more, I just happened to see somebody had Potbellies for quite cheap. It was $50 to $75 or so, I think it was. And I went over to get one Potbelly from them. I showed up and they said, here's the deal. You can have it for free if you take all the other ones with it.
Right.
So I came home with a utility trailer full of 5 Potbellies, and we butchered most of those out after a month, and I kept just one of those, one sow. Eventually I found another boar. And we started doing a little bit of breeding in them. But one of the other important reasons why I went with that breed was I have just 1 acre, and I am in an agriculturally zoned area in my township. I mean, very rural farm town. There's 2,000 people in my town, and most of them are farmers. But township rules say that if I have less than 5 acres, I'm not allowed large livestock. And large livestock were defined as hogs, cattle, and horses. So I got to talking with some people at the township, and we have decided on a technicality that potbelly pigs are not large livestock because they're small. So that's the other reason why I'm raising potbellies.
Interesting.
So they're small, so I can get around that. They were cheap to get a hold of, and they're fairly common as far as a heritage breed. They're probably the most common heritage breed that I found just looking around. Cheap too. I mean, consider like the coonies. When I'm looking at those, I mean, their prices have come down a little bit, but they're still usually $500 or more for a fairly small cooney, and that's a lot of money if you wanted to get 2 or 3 to start a small breeding operation.
Right. Yeah, for sure.
And I mean, the guinea hogs and, you know, all these other small breeds too, it's the same thing, except for the potbellies. They're all quite expensive. And it's really just because, looking into it all, the potbellies were the first small breed hog that really kind of came around in quite a while. And they're just not new anymore. They're not a fad, but there's still so much of a fad for the coonies, and the guinea hogs are still fairly a bit of a fad animal. And then you look at the Idaho pasture pigs, even though some of those can get quite large, that's a whole interesting fad in itself, and that just keeps the prices high for now. So the potbellies, they're cheap, they're usually easy to find, they're small, and they're incredibly hardy and do very well on these different alternative diets. We do a lot of alternative feeds, and I grow a lot of our own feeds too, and they do quite well on it all. They also do well on a little lower protein feed than your normal commercial hogs do.
Interesting. That's great. So let me ask you, and then we'll get in and talk about your feed and your rotation and all the things you've got going on there on the land. But I do want to ask you, this is a revenue producing part of your farm. And this is not a hobby animal that you just like to have 17 hogs running around. You are producing an income from this, correct?
I produce a small income, and I produce quite a bit of meat for our family. I mean, honestly, between the pigs and then our chickens and rabbits and my produce garden, that's well over half of the food that my family goes through in a year. And on top of that, I do sell a few hogs. Yeah. Not a lot, although now, so I started with 1 sow, and then I got a second, and now I have a 3rd sow, and they're all pregnant now. So come about end of January, I'm going to have to really start figuring out how to sell more pigs. And I do have a small clientele list of people that regularly buy pigs, 1 or 2 a year from me. And then I've come across a lot of people who were interested when I described the type of pig and the type and quality of meat. And an interesting thing about it, by the way, is it seems to me like, to a point, it's easier to sell people on a smaller pig carcass than on a large one, because it's a lot smaller of a purchase at once.
Yeah, and let me ask you this: Would give me your your sales pitch, if you would. If I was a potential customer, it's like, well, I've never considered a potbelly as a food source or a breed that you would butcher and eat. Explain, the meat, the amount that you're going to get, kind of all the details of the confirmation of it, that type of stuff.
Well, first off, I don't usually say potbelly because that can just evoke the wrong ideas in people. And golly, there is a pet crowd that the pet pig people, they are quite vicious. And I've actually had twice where people in the potbelly pig pet groups have called the sheriff on me and about animal abuse. And I had to talk with the sheriff and deal all that crud out. But so I usually start off with just telling people, it usually comes up in conversation, something about pigs or livestock in general. And I'll mention that I raise meat pigs, and what we raise is a small breed heritage Asian pig, or just a small breed Asian pig. And that they're a specialty pig with just a deeper flavor, a much richer flavor, and a richer textured meat, and with much more deep marbling throughout the meat than your standard light-colored market hogs of today. So the meat that we raise, it's a more pronounced flavor. It cooks down better. You don't get dry pork chops. And there's usually my bigger selling point there. Pork chops that aren't dry when they're cooked.
Yeah, good. Very good. Very good. What's the typical yield? So if somebody's going to get a whole hog from you, how do you talk about yield and those type of things?
There's a whole other side of things in itself. I know most people with these smaller breed pigs usually let them go to like 18 months or even 24 months because they're trying to push something closer to a standard market hog size carcass. And I can't really do that just because it gets so inefficient on feed when you let them get that old. And it's just the price that I would have to charge to make a very small profit would be too ridiculous. So I butcher instead of market size or butcher size, I do butcher age, which is about 7 months, fairly standard for hogs, because they're at that age, they're about at their peak of between efficiency in growing and putting on a little fat. Past there, their efficiency goes down and they get fat easier. So I'll butcher at about 7 months, and I usually have a 50 to 55 pound animal on the hoof, and I'll get about half of that in pork when I butcher them out. So I'll usually end up with around 25 pounds of pork.
Okay. So how does that 25 pounds, obviously that definitely makes that cost effective. And you talked about a pork chop. So how big a pork chop are we talking here?
Well, I don't usually actually slice them into your classic chops.
Mm-hmm.
When I do them more like a double medallion cut, like what I would expect to see in a lamb chop, where you keep the whole that whole backbone loin. Instead of splitting it down the middle, you keep it in one piece and put a little bit of rib on it, and then you slice the whole thing off in one, so you get kind of double medallions out of it.
Okay.
But generally, actually, when I do custom processing on these animals as well when I sell them, and my standard custom processing is just what I call the family cuts package, which is I cut everything into pot roast pieces. And from there, if they want it cut down more, some of them I can. I don't have a really good bone saw, so I'm not really sawing the chops down much. I have. It's just with that smaller loin size, it just kind of gets shredded up too easily in my saw. So I generally don't do that. Usually, I can't think of it offhand how many cuts I get, more primal type cuts. I just did a video on that on YouTube. Maybe I should watch it again. But everything comes out to between a 2 and a 4 pound cut when I'm finished.
Okay. Do you do anything with the belly, or is that still part of your roasts?
The belly is generally kept in just one piece unless I rip it a little bit when I'm skinning the animal, which happens sometimes. Then I'll cut it into 2 separate halves, and I roll it up and I package it and I label it as belly roll.
Interesting.
And I recommend that just be marinated and slow cooked. And I'll usually tell people that if you put a little liquid smoke in there, it makes basically what I call a bacon roast.
Wow, interesting. Yeah, that's a very unique take on processing. And my goodness, you talk about being busy, and you're also doing your own custom processing. You've got quite a few things going on.
Yeah, it's unique, and it took me. And I've worked with a few other people on what we think the more appropriate way to process these potbellies are, because they are so much smaller. Some of the cuts, they're not going to work. And so we've had to do some different styles of processing. And what it comes back to is we went and looked at a lot of the traditional ways that these small hogs are utilized throughout Asia. And for the most part, it's just they're used traditionally as roast pieces. And then maybe the edges, the nice meaty, thick edges of those roasts are trimmed off and more like a stir fry kind of meat. But just it lends itself well. The pig lends itself well to a nice dinner-sized roast, not so much to smaller cuts.
Okay. Is there much grind? Do you do any grinding with it?
I have. Generally, until recently, I'm butchering all these pigs hot carcass, and so I don't usually grind it much at that point. I've found that when I'm grinding a hot hunk of meat fresh off the animal, it tends to get kind of wet and mushy.
Yeah.
It doesn't grind well.
Yeah.
But now I've got actually just a large refrigerator that I can put 2 pigs in at once after I skin them, and I can chill those in there for a few days. And then if I want to, I can grind it. Generally, I don't unless my wife asks me to make some sausage.
Yeah, and so obviously these Asian pigs are considered lard pigs, so I assume you get a decent amount of lard, scale-wise, of course, that you can render and use for other reasons.
Yeah. I do try to watch the amount of fat on my pigs because I don't want them ridiculously fat. I don't want to put so much feed into them that they start getting wasteful, and I have seen that if I want to get a pig very fat, it tends to take more feed to me than it's worth. So generally, I like to see around a ½ inch of fat when I'm butchering these animals at 7 months, which, I mean, that would be like on a full-size regular hog, that would be something like around 4 or 4.5 inches worth if you put it to scale. Wow. So they are on the fatty side when I'm looking at it that way. I'll get something like about a gallon of lard off of 150-pound potbelly.
Wow. Okay.
Rendered down lard.
Goodness. That's pretty good.
And that is, I mean, I usually scrap out the carcass pretty well. I want to leave a nice little fat cap on it, but not too much. It's easily overpowered if you have too much fat on those things. And then I'll scrape the fat off the hide, and all of that just gets chopped up and thrown in the crock pot overnight. And I'll have about a gallon of lard, plus or minus, off of 150-ish pound potbelly.
Wow. That's impressive. So
that's actually one of the sales points that I have. Just some of the people who have been so interested were very interested in the lard. The first person I sold a pig to is an acquaintance of my wife. She's a nutritional researcher, and she actually came to me because she heard that I was getting into pigs and wanted to know how I was raising them and feeding them. When I described what I was wanting to do, she told me she'd buy 1 or 2 minimum every year because the fat, that lady, she knows her stuff. She was telling me all these unique properties that I should expect in the lard and how amazing that was going to be. And so she orders her pigs extra fat.
That's great. Well, that's great. I mean, it sounds like you've got a great little niche market there of people that know what to expect, or as you said, is a good entry level for a smaller investment to test, to stick their toe in the water when it comes to buying pork like that. But that's really interesting. I would say I was skeptical at first, but I like what you're saying, and obviously you know what lane to stay in.
It is interesting.
Yeah.
and it's very different for sure.
Yeah. Well, let's switch gears a little bit and talk about your feed, because I think this is something that is also very impressive, and I like the way you approach this, because it comes back to the economy of what you're doing, the economy of maintaining and establishing as much efficiency on your 1 acre, but also just the overall inputs, just not throwing a lot of money into something. So explain to our listeners a bit your feed regimen and how you're handling that.
Yeah, sure. I have two parts to our feed regimen. The first part is what I grow and what we produce here on our own property. I mean, everything from the produce that I can't sell at the farmer's market. So I bring it home, and after 2 or 3 days, it doesn't look pretty anymore. So, and I can only handle so many tomatoes myself. So the pigs get quite a lot of that. And then standard kitchen scraps and kitchen waste, of course. And we do have a few areas of perennial pasture kind, wouldn't even call it a pasture. I let the wild grass grow along the sides a bit. And I make sure to always bring an armful of grass to the pigs at least every few days. And then I grow a few plots of corn every year. I play around with some different corns. I only grow flint corn because it's a higher protein corn. And I'm trying to always to kind of get away from some of the soy a little bit, just from some of the possible health concerns that it has, along with the heavy use of soy. So we grow some flint corns, and I grow a lot of tree fodder. We have about 1,200 poplar trees that I left along in the back when we cleared out the main forest. I pollarded them, which is just trimming small trees down to approximately shoulder-ish height, so they kind of grow real shrubby. And I'll just go or my girls have been, that's been their summer job, just picking a bucket full of green leaves every day to give to the pigs. And that is actually the only mineral that I really give the pigs, at least during the summer months. I don't buy any hog mineral because I tried some and I didn't see any functional benefits from it during the months where they have that green feed available. And those tree leaves, it's got a very high ash content, very high mineral content. When you look into it, it actually quite impressed me. And so that's all the minerals they need during that time of the year. Let's see. We do buy feed. I buy whole corn and whole oats from a farmer up the road. And that's generally about 50% of their total diet is going to be these whole grains, and then I ferment them. And I will mix the ratios of the yellow corn and oats depending on what I think they need at the time. The oats being more like a 12% protein, and the corn is closer to an 8. So I'll add more protein, a little bit more protein kind of towards the fall here. It seemed to help them out the past couple of years. And then I'll back off on the oats if I think they need more calories, more energy in their diet, and it'll be more of a corn heavy. But I'm fermenting it out until I get a pH of approximately 4.3, which I have found through my own work and through research. That's about the goalpost of now I have functionally processed the grains so that they're incredibly digestible, just as good as if you had them ground into a mash. And they have a much higher protein content when I do ferment them, anywhere from a 20 to a 40% gain is what I've seen through research, and just through kind of my estimates of how they're doing on this fermented grain based on regular hog feed. I think I generally get around a 30 to 35% increase in protein. And the protein that I'm attempting to target through all of this, which is, it's a little tricky because I'm trying to balance a lot of things out that are hard without actually measuring the protein content constantly. But I'm trying to target more of around a 14% overall protein in their diet. And I've even gone down a little bit lower than that before, and it's done fairly well for them. This breed, because they're not a bodybuilder type hog, they don't need quite so much protein in their diet. They do better actually with a higher dose of fiber than a lot of the other pigs. they were just talking about something similar to that. What's that podcast? The Just Swining It podcast, I think it is, where they had a man talking about, a geneticist talking about the genetical differences in some of the heritage breed pigs versus the commercial market hogs that dictate their gut flora, basically, and how different feeds can be more appropriate to the different breeds based on how their gut tends to function. And what I've found, and many others have found, is that the Potbellies and a lot of the other heritage breeds, they handle a higher fiber diet better, more than your standard, say, 5 to 10% fiber in the diet. They handle more fiber, and they actually seem to do better if I give them a higher fiber diet than your standard market hog diet too.
Interesting. Well, it sounds like you've definitely done quite a bit of homework there and research, and that's really good data to look into. So in that, would you say, have you thought about if you were going out and just buying commercial feed for your herd and maintaining them on that versus what you're doing with raising some of your own, of course, the fermenting? Have you looked and estimated a cost savings with that? Do you have any kind of gauge?
Oh yeah, and I did. I had to at least try for at one time raising up some of my pigs on a standard commercial hog feed. So I went down into Cedar Springs and I bought myself a few bags of hog feed, which, to put it in perspective, usually you're somewhere between 600 and 800 pounds of feed for a regular hog. Potbellies, it's about 3 bags of feed, maybe a little more if you wanted to go longer, but usually it's around 150 pounds of pig feed to feed out a Potbelly.
That's hilarious.
So it was a cheap enough experiment to run. I got a slight bit more growth when I did that. Of course, it was only in the summer too, not the winter months. But they also got fatter, and I didn't really like that. And I actually read some reports on that too. There was a report crudely translated from Russian, a little hard to read, but basically saying that on the standard commercial feeds, Potbellies tended to get a little bit fatter too quickly once they hit about 5 months old, and I saw that too. But as far as cost goes, it cost me about $2 a pound in feed only to raise out a Potbelly, or most any pig. It's around that same level of feed to yield. It costs about $2 a pound. And with the feed that I'm buying, I buy the grain that I buy is half price of a hog mash in town. And by fermenting it, I really don't need to add any additional protein. Sometimes I add much difference. So I've ended up between about 40 cents and 60 cents a pound when I put all the numbers down.
Wow.
So that's about 1/4 the cost.
Yeah, that's great. That's great.
And that was my main reason for really sticking with it originally. I mean, not really thinking about trying to sell any, but I'm bringing meat to the table for way cheaper than I can buy it at the grocery store.
Yeah. And that's the main thing. And you said something there I think I want to point out again, because make sure people heard that with what you're doing on an acre, that you said probably 50 to 60% of your family intake is coming off that land. And that's incredible.
Oh yeah. Last year I calculated everything up meticulously, and we were right at about 50% of our total food intake and caloric intake and protein all combined. We're right at about 50%.
Yeah.
And this year, I think I did a little more. I just didn't monitor it as closely.
Interesting. So family of 7. Now, obviously, is that going to be more of a challenge as those kids get a little older? You think you're going to max out somewhere?
Well, I'm sure at some point I will. I'll also say that I am looking for property. We've been saving our pennies since we got married, and I've got a little cash, so the only issue is nobody's selling.
Yeah.
I would love to buy 10 acres somewhere quite close by, close enough that I could just run down at any time, or maybe even walk over just a couple miles away. so that I'd be close enough that I can actually manage the property well and put some animals there. And if it's 10 acres, or actually if it's 10.1 acres, according to township regulations, they basically don't have any say over anything anymore that I do agriculturally. So that's what I'm hoping for.
Yeah. Very good. Very good. So that was going to be my next question, was future plans going forward. So looking for land that's that size, so it gives you the freedom to do some additional things. But do you have any other plans going forward as far as expansion or additional testing and research?
Well, I keep dabbling around in different areas of testing different feeds and unique feed products and some different mixes and blends. And I'm kind of always going to do that because that's just my nature, to try things. Sometimes when I explain some of these tests or trials I want to do to some of the other pig farmers, they seem to think that I've been hit in the head with a monkey wrench or something. But I like to try out these different things, and with research behind them, some of these things sound like they might be interesting, like Jerusalem artichoke. This is one of the feed crops that I played around with last year. We fed a few 100 pounds of those to our pigs last year. This year, I'm going to do about the same, a few 100 pounds, just kind of as a going into winter supplemental feed for our pigs. And next year, I'm taking a lot of the excess this fall, and I'm planting the entire boundaries of my property with these Jerusalem artichokes because they did pretty well last year. And they grow very productive. It's a lot of starch. Basically, it's about like a potato, but more easily digestible to pigs. And I'm going to plant one of my pig paddocks with a large portion of these Jerusalem artichokes when the pigs aren't in it here in the fall, when I move them into their next rotational paddock. And that's going to be my trial, really, is to go very heavy on that as a feed source and see how they do.
Interesting. Very interesting. Yeah, I love that stuff. And I think that's what really makes pastured pigs that much more exciting is there's so much opportunity to experiment with some things and obviously just adapt to what you're given, whether it's 100 acres or 1 acre, it's 60-degree slope or flat, then you're just going to test it and see what works for you in that situation. So I think that's incredible.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, I would love 60 acres, but it just seems like that's going to be a long time away before I could ever do something like that.
Sure.
So,
yeah.
But for the meantime, I'm making it work where I am and making it productive and efficient. I'm not going to be one of those more hobby farm scenarios that just begins to be a bit of a money pit because, well, I don't have the funds to support that anyway. So everything I do, I'm trying to keep it sensible and reasonable, even if it sounds odd at first.
Yeah, I like that. Well, that's a good philosophy to go by. I think when you're looking at the economy, the economics of it and being frugal, it makes things work a lot better. And I know there's times where I've lost sight of keeping track of costs, and at the end look and say, well, this I feel like I was really busy this year, but how come my checking account looks smaller than it should be? And then realize, well, you'd lost sight of these type of things and just allowed it to get out of control. And I think that's a great approach to it, especially when you're looking at scaling up and eventually buying larger land and doing that type of stuff. Not just work yourself to death, but work smarter into a goal. So
we have some really fun plans for if and when we get that 10 acres. My wife and I, we definitely expanding a bit with the pigs, and I've delved quite deeply into designing these different types of silvopasture systems on paper and various different setups of rotational grazing paddocks with annual crops and perennial tree crops, nut crops, fruit crops. I've got all kinds of things that I would love to do someday, and I'm doing some of it here now. I have one mature apple tree that we got about 350, maybe 400 pounds of apples on this year.
Wow.
And that, I figured the calorie content of those out. It comes out to, it takes about 200 pounds of apples to equal about 50 pounds worth of corn when I figured by calories. So there's not a whole lot of feed that comes off of one apple tree, but it's a good start. And we planted 7 apple trees this spring, 7 younger ones. And one of the nice things I have is we're in apple country. I mean, there's literally Apple Avenue, Peach Road, right down the street. We have orchards and small old farm orchards everywhere. Most properties have a small old neglected orchard on them somewhere around here. And I have access to all the apples I want basically from mid-August to even now. We still have apples on some of the late crop trees. And so I've been going around with my minivan and my wagon, just picking up apples from the neighbors' yards and bringing them over for the pigs.
Yep.
And I would love to have more of that kind of setup for my own pigs. Right now, actually, I don't know if you're familiar with Nick Ferguson.
Yeah.
He's fairly big in the kind of alternative feeds world.
Yeah.
I went to a class that he was holding up in Michigan this year, and I bought a bunch of trees from him. I have a few nut trees, and I have 40 mulberry trees, and I'm planting those all around the outside edge of my pig paddock area. And a little thing that he mentioned during the class we were talking about was as they start to grow, they get up about 10 to 15 feet tall, is that put a heavy stake in the ground and a rope and goes on an angle up over into the pig pen. So all of that fruit's always going to drop in the pig pen. Well, that's going to give me a nice source of sugary starch in June, which is I can't have any other crops locally that are really a starch crop that early, but that's going to be my starch crop in June. And for about a month to a month and a half, we'll be able to have those dropping just for the pigs out of the trees. And about by the time that's finished, we're going to be I'll have a little break where there's not any good crops coming. But the next thing is in August, we have early apples that are falling off the trees. And then I'll have apples throughout August and September. I grow some early season corns and then some late season corn. So I'm picking corn in September, early September or end of August, and then I'm picking another crop about a month later. So the idea ultimately is going to be to incorporate a lot more trees into this program so that we'll have a good source of starchy feed and eventually some protein feed from some of the higher protein nuts that are just naturally falling down for the pigs, so that I'll be able to at least halfway through finish out a pig on more or less wild feed.
Yeah.
That's the end goal.
Yeah. That'd be great. Man, that's awesome. I love your approach to this, and I love the fact that you're tracking all this data and taking the time to flesh out all the details. That way you can kind of see how things are developing as you go along. Well, Jordy, I want to be sensitive to your time, but because I know you even had to leave the house for this interview, and I appreciate that. But let me ask you something. I have to ask you what I ask everybody. So, in your experience so far, what is your favorite part about raising pigs on pasture?
I wouldn't even say it's just exclusive to pigs on pasture, but my favorite part about all of this whole thing is what I've called the law of multiplication. And that is just that I can take one thing and turn it into several things. And I can take a few things and turn it into many things. I can, with the proper attitude and mindset, I can go into a scenario, even a less than perfect scenario, and I can work to cause it to flourish and be productive and to be a healthy, life-giving environment. And that's by far what drives me on in all this.
Awesome. That's excellent. Well said. Well, I want to give you an opportunity to talk about, there's two things. You have a good web presence. You have your website and you have your YouTube channel where you're obviously discussing a lot of the details and sharing with people not only what you've got going on there with the pigs, but the overall homesteading approach and how you're able to do what you're doing on 1 acre. And I think even though we're kind of pig centric here, I think that would be really helpful for our listeners to hear about. So give a shout out, give a plug for your website and your YouTube channel, and maybe just a quick description of what's going on there.
Oh, sure. My website, Northern Homesteading, which is at northernhomesteading.com. That is, it's an informational blog style website. I'm writing informational articles, generally a few every week on there, in an assortment of homesteading topics, focusing on sustainability and productivity and what you're doing. I do a lot of work around alternative feeds too. That's kind of my big thing. And then my YouTube channel, that's more of an educational side, or a different side of the educational side of it, I guess. And that's Homestead Know-How. That's where I had started by doing a bunch of courses here. I teach some homesteading courses locally in town, and I started putting some of those together in more of a video type format and cutting them up into smaller bits. And I've got a lot of that material out on YouTube. Some of the more detailed stuff is restricted to a membership, which is $2.99, I think, for a month membership, and you get the more in-depth videos there.
Very good.
But yeah, the website and the YouTube channel, northernhomesteading.com, and Homestead Know-How on YouTube is full of great information, and I'm doing my very best to keep regular information coming out.
Excellent. Well, good. I appreciate all your hard work, and it's definitely noted in what you have online, and clearly in this discussion, see that you've got attention to detail when it comes to tracking stuff, and I really like that. I respect that a lot. Well, I can't thank you enough for coming on the podcast. I'm going to let you go so you can get home to your lovely family and be able to complete your evening. And man, I just enjoyed the conversation. It was good talking with you.
Alrighty. Well, this was fun.
Well, that was a good conversation with Jordy. Appreciate him coming on and sharing his story with the pot-bellied pigs. That's not an angle I would have expected, but it seems like he's got something good going on there. Well, this is number 3. Again, I appreciate everybody listening, and we will get a 4th one ready and be queued up for next week. And then our queue is empty. So if you know anybody that needs to be on the podcast or should a topic we need to discuss, just send me an email, troy@redtoolhouse.com. All right, y'all take care.
We hope you have enjoyed this episode of the Pastured Pig Podcast. To learn more about our podcast or to submit topics or recommend guests for future episodes, visit redtoolhouse.com.